Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the Reagan Library in Simi, California, where we are at the 2016 Reagan National Defense Forum. Our coverage here has been sponsored by Raytheon, and we have with us Deborah James, who is the Secretary of the United States Air Force. Ma'am, thanks very much for meeting with us.
Thank you, Vago. Great to see you.
It's great seeing you at this conference. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you was there is a transition that's ongoing. Landing teams have been arriving all over the department, and I know that you've met with them as well from the Trump team. What are some of the things they're telling you, and what are some of the things that you're telling them about the priorities that they should consider as they build their plans for the United States Air Force?
Well, the team at this point is very much in a listening mode. They're receiving materials, they're receiving briefings. So far, I've personally engaged with one of the team members. Our Chief of Staff has had a more complete meeting, and there'll be more meetings to come. But the types of things that we've been talking about in our sessions have been budgetary matters. It's the importance of continuing to grow our Air Force, our end strength in a total force way, so that's active duty, National Guard, and Reserve. We need to continue to focus to increase our high-end readiness. God forbid that we should get into such a fight. We want to be as ready as possible. And of course, also very importantly, we need to modernize. And that is true for both our conventional forces, like the F-35, the new tanker, and so on. But it is also very important for our nuclear enterprise, as well as cyber and space.
As you look at to the modernization agenda, though, if there's going to be more money, as it appears that there's going to be, Chairman Thornberry has told us that, Lindsey Graham today said that there will be more money, although he looks at it as a little bit of a tougher fight to get more money. And there is almost universal acknowledgement that the Budget Control Act is going to be scrapped, right? So that lifts the amount of spending that can go into it. From a modernization standpoint, does it now make sense that if there's going to be more money, to continue to modernize very aging and expensive assets at this point, the F-15 fleet and the F-16 fleet? And does it make more sense to sort of drive to that next generation of capability, whether it's increasing the amount of spending for the Joint Strike Fighter for the F-35, for restarting the F-22, or for developing the new sixth generation airplane, but on a much more accelerated basis?
Well, the answer I would give you is it all depends. So first of all, I certainly hope, and I too believe, that there is greater momentum, perhaps, to repeal the Budget Control Act, to repeal sequestration once and for all. But until it's done, it's not done. So that's point number one. Point number two is first things first. First thing is to get the FY17 appropriation bill passed. And it's been concerning to me because over the last several days, I've been hearing more and more about a continuing resolution that might take us through April or May. And then I've even heard speculation perhaps it would take for the rest of the fiscal year, which would be damaging. And the greatest irony of all would be if we end up with less money in FY17 because of a long-term continuing resolution in a year when everybody is talking about the need to do more. So that's really important that we get that appropriation settled for FY17. Now, in terms of does it make sense to do a skip and retire some of the older aircraft in order to put more money and accelerate the generation to come, like the F-35? The answer is perhaps, but as you know, we've had a great deal of difficulty getting that approach through the Congress. Moreover, the older aircraft can be very helpful in the fight against ISIL and some of the day-to-day operations.
I was going to say that I think you're probably talking about the A-10 incident, which ended up becoming something that was very, very tough for everybody. Is that what you were talking about in terms of the challenges of retiring an aging airframe?
There was that one, but there have been other aircraft as well, which we proposed the retirement gradually of several of these aircraft with reluctance, but because of budgetary concerns.
And how much did that increase your costs to keep all these airplanes in the inventory, the KC-10 as well as the A-10s? Ultimately, I mean, how expensive was that for you after having made that decision to sort of backtrack and say, okay, they've got to stay in service now?
Well, in rough order of magnitude terms, we had originally calculated that by gradually retiring the A-10 over 5 years, we would save on the order of about $4 billion. We also had wanted to transfer the people associated with the A-10 and redirect them to other jobs, to include the F-35, but other jobs within the force. The fact that none of that happened means that, again, in rough terms, that's a $4 billion bill that we needed to figure out how to do. And the fact that the people couldn't transfer exacerbated what is already certain shortages that we have across the Air Force.
From a people standpoint, everybody is talking about the importance of increasing the size of the Army, for example. How much larger does the United States Air Force needs to be in order to be able to do the missions that the nation expects it to do?
Well, just a year and a half ago, we were at the level on the active duty Air Force side of about 311,000. And that was pretty much when General Welsh said, enough is enough. We simply cannot reduce any farther. And indeed, that was after ISIL burst upon the world scene. We realized that we needed more. So we've been on an upward trajectory. Now we're at about 317. We're heading toward 321 over the next year or so. And in my opinion, we need to get to the mid 320s. So think 324, 325 as a minimum. And then if we want to go beyond that to help with the cyber missions, the ISR missions, then possibly beyond that as well. But I consider the mid 320,000s for the active duty force. And by the way, everything we do is total force, so we also want to modestly increase our National Guard and Reserve ranks.
The relationship with the National Guard and Reserve had gotten quite bad between those and the active duty force, and that's something that you focused on. What were the keys to rebuilding the relationship with those two forces and the Air Force to make the family happy again?
A very important aspect of all of this was communication and having joint decisions and joint responsibility, not only for missions, but for budgetary matters and for telling the story to the Congress and to the American people of the importance of air power. And so there have been a lot of actions taken, but I would say chief among them were a much more inclusionary effort, outreach between the active duty, the National Guard, and Reserve. For example, in all of our major budget deliberations now, not only do we have the director of the Air National Guard and the Air Force Reserve at our side, but we also have two adjutants general from states around the country to make sure that we get that state perspective as well. And then in addition to that, we're integrating more, and we have continued to shift missions where it makes sense to do so. So all of this is part and parcel of our total force, better communication going forward.
You've been the secretary now for 3 years. What do you rank as your accomplishments? And what? Hang on, stop. I'm going to go to someplace else, and then I'm going to come to that, because that's got to be the last question I ask you. One of your other priorities has also been the nuclear cheating scandal in the missile force. You know, you've said that you came in with your own agenda, and then all of a sudden this crisis breaks, where once again the United States Air Force and its nuclear stewardship was being questioned. Right after your visit here to the Reagan Library, you're going to be visiting some of the missile bases. Are you satisfied that that issue has been resolved definitively?
Well, I'm very satisfied that the crux of that cheating situation has been solved. But what that cheating situation taught me, Vago, was that there were much greater issues afoot within our nuclear enterprise. And as a result of that bad incident, I think a lot of good has happened in the last 3 years. We have shifted billions of dollars toward the nuclear enterprise. We've shifted upwards of 1,000 people to plug certain holes. We've pumped readiness funding into it, and we have begun the very important modernization of our ICBM force as well as our bomber force. So when it comes to the nuclear enterprise, however, it's very important that we maintain the focus. So we don't ever want to say, everything's fixed, everything's good, let's redirect somewhere else. No, that's not the way to go. Relentless follow-up on these sorts of matters is crucial, and that will be something for the next administration to also keep track of.
You mentioned bomber. The Air Force has always maintained that it would like to get a lot more bombers, and has worked to try to control the cost as much, to try to get as many of the airplanes as possible. If budget was not an option, how many bombers does the Air Force really need? How many more B-21s are necessary than what the service has currently stated might be its need?
I'd have to really yield to the warfighter on that, but I can tell you this, that we're marching toward a B-21 Raider fleet of about 100 aircraft, that we worked very hard on the acquisition strategy to make sure that we picked a price point up front, that we made that a key performance parameter, and we've stuck to it. We also have worked hard to use mature technologies. So this is a complex system, but it's not doing everything originally from scratch. So we are using mature technologies. Of course, they have to be integrated together and they have to go on a platform, and that is still a complex and difficult matter. But we think we've got it very much under control, and we're going to continue to march forward. And I would say 100 is the minimum. And remember, it wouldn't be the B-21 alone. We have other bomber assets, and we're in the process of conducting a bomber study to sort of give us the roadmap of how the various elements of the bomber force would take us into the future.
What do you think the sixth-generation fighter needs to look like? I mean, the Air Force is really the only fifth-generation force. It's had tremendous experience with stealth that the other services haven't had. It has the F-22. It's going to get the F-35. What does that next-generation Air Force fighter need to look like? Because I know that you and the Air Force team have been working on that.
Well, we feel fairly confident that what we need to do is to continue to push the envelope when it comes to penetrating counter-air. Now, whether that is a jet fighter alone or whether it's a family of systems, perhaps it contains ISR elements. That is what we're still exploring. So I can't tell you exactly what it would look like or what the framework would be, but penetrating counter-air is something that we feel that we're going to continue to need.
Two very last quick questions. You've been an advocate for air power. You've made the case for it. Why is it that still 100 years into this whole, more than 100 years into the air power game, that air power still tends to get maligned and underrated in terms of what it's bringing to the joint fight?
Well, I think it's bringing a huge complement to the joint fight, first of all. Second of all, I think air power is a little bit like oxygen. You take it for granted, it's kind of always there for you, but boy, if you're without it, you're in a world of hurt. I also think that air power is sometimes very much visible and out in front. So for example, when we're striking against ISIL in the Middle East, that's something that tends to capture the headlines. But the mobility mission, perhaps we take for granted that cargo and people arrive and airdrops occur when they are supposed to occur. Other elements of air power, I guess, beyond the strike, is what is a little bit behind the scenes and people don't focus on as much. But I would submit to you, it's like oxygen, and if you don't have it, you're going to want it, and you're going to be in a world of hurt.
That's a quote worth writing down. The last question I have for you is, what are the things you're most proud about in your tenure, and what are the things that you wish you had a do-over on?
Well, if I could be remembered for one thing, and what I feel most proud about is trying to do my very best for the people of the Air Force. So stopping the downsizing, initiating a growth path in terms of the numbers of people in our Air Force, focusing on family and spouse issues, making sure that people are properly compensated, introducing enlisted pilots into the world of our ISR Global Hawk force, women in the military. These are the types of issues that I feel most proud about that I got to work on.
Thanks so very much. Thanks very much for all your accessibility over the years. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Vago. Appreciate it.